Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Kunal Keshri, Assistant Professor at G.V. Pant Social Science Institute, Allahabad. Today we will be covering a part of paper on migration and urbanization. The module is entitled as Determinants and Consequences of Internal Migration. Learning objectives of this module are to understand determinants of internal migration, then consequences of internal migration such as consequences on rural areas and consequences on urban areas. Internal migration is the movement of people from one administrative area to another within a country. With a few exceptions, the evidence suggests that internal population movements are increasing. Migration has become an important livelihood strategy for many poor groups across the world in its various forms, whether it is permanent or semi-permanent migration or temporary migration. While it is no panacea for the poor, it can bring many benefits, and this is being recognized in some policy and research circles. While international migration has received more attention in recent debates on migration, internal migration is far more significant in terms of the numbers of people involved and perhaps even the quantum of remittances and poverty reduction potential of these. It is important to mention here that the nature of migration varies geographically both in levels as well as trends. Therefore, most research done in this area has been ad hoc in nature, oriented to specific problems and producing results that are not comparable with those of other studies. Consequently, in explaining the determinants and consequences of internal migration, it is not feasible to account for the different forms of migration. Therefore, this module is devoted to explain the causes and consequences of internal migration, accounting for the most significant form of rural to urban migration only. Now coming to determinants of internal migration. The concepts which usually explain the determinants or causes of migration are push-pull mechanism, migration, distance, migration to explore frontier settlement, migration arising out of population pressure, migration occurring due to urge for better work prospects or for higher education. The push-pull theory, which echoes common sense by saying that some people move because they have been pulled or attracted to some place else. Push factors are unemployment, lack of safety, lack of services, poverty, crop failure, drought, war, civil unrest, hazards, etc. Pull factors are potential for employment, a safer atmosphere, better service provision, greater wealth, fertile land, good food supplies, political security and stability, less risk of natural hazards, etc. This idea was first put forward by Ramenstein in 1889, who analyzed migration in England using data from the 1881 census of England and Wales, and considered that pull factors were important than push factors. He was of the view that it is the desire to get ahead more than the desire to escape an unpleasant situation. that is most responsible for the voluntary migration of people, at least in late 19th century England. The potential migrant weighs the push and pull factors and moves if the benefit of doing so exceed the costs, and then takes decision to migrate. In many developing countries like India, low agricultural incomes and agricultural unemployment and underemployment are the major factors compelling natives to move towards areas with better job opportunities. The pressure of population, resulting in a high man-land ratio, is one of the important causes of poverty and outmigration from rural areas. In fact, with a given mode of production, only a part of the labor force can be absorbed in agriculture, unless the non-crop husbandry sectors like dairying, poultry, forestry and fisheries, and cottage and small-scale industries in rural areas absorb the surplus. These people have no option but to move to the urban centers in order to be gainfully employed. Now, coming to another important aspect of determinants of internal migration in India, which is spatial disorganization. Spatial disorganization is an important feature of internal migration in India. The recent pattern of interstate migration are almost similar to the pattern of initial 3 decades after the independence. It is worth mentioning that the same type of migration streams which had been occurring in the last 100 years from the economically backward states of UP and Bihar to the coastal foreign enclaves and chiffoning ports of Mumbai, then Bombay, and Kolkata, then Calcutta, have persisted for decades and continue even today. In fact, migrants are actually pulled towards the ports of Bombay and Kolkata and their peripheries. Thus, the centrifugal force exerted by these exporting centers, and which created by the sectioning mechanisms in the past, still persists today and prevent the emergence of centripetal forces at the local levels in the interior of the country. In the rural settings, we find an increasing trend of unemployment and poverty, which is mainly due to the low rate of investment in agriculture, fragmentation of land ownership, inequalities in the distribution of land and other productive assets, allocation mechanisms which discriminate in favor of the owners of wealth, and a pattern of investment and technological change which is biased against labor. While these forces have led to rural or rural to urban migration among the very poor, the new policies of the government to educate people by opening new schools in rural areas has stimulated out-migration by the more selective rural youth. Some of them migrate to improve their education and skill and acquire higher education, while others leave dissatisfied with the prospects of rural life. Educational opportunities, medical services, cultural and entertainment activities, and many other facilities are just not there in villages or are available at a very modest scale. In addition, a number of other factors such as the presence of social networks, in urban destinations, which often provide initial help and financial security, and the desire of migrants to break away from the traditional constraints of the rural social structure are cited as the likely determinants of migration. The state policies also exercise a powerful influence on the distribution of population as between rural and urban areas. The most significant among these are policies which foster a concentrated growth of industrial infrastructure in the cities, import substitution programs which are mainly oriented towards meeting the consumption needs of well-to-do urban classes, and social investment which are preponderantly urban. Mechanism of underdevelopment and migration can be understood with example of low-income countries like India. In these countries, migration occurs as a special symptom of underdevelopment and regional distinct calculations in the space economy. Here, underdevelopment is neither a lower stage of development nor lagging behind, but rather a product of a specific development which has been induced by the penetration of the capitalist colonial world economy. On the Indian scene, the metropolitan center pushed towards the sales of its own semi-finished goods into the colony, faced with a severe competition from the locally manufacturing goods. It proceeded to suppress the development of the colony's indigenous handicrafts, cottage industries, and small industries, which lead to migration of rural people to the cities for livelihood. Now, coming to consequences of internal migration. The consequences of internal migration can broadly be classified into two categories: consequences on the place of origin, mostly rural areas, and consequences on destination places, which are mostly urban areas. The effect of migration on the rural areas can be conveniently divided into two categories: first, on rural income distribution; second, on technological change. Now, coming to the effect of rural incomes and distribution. In a dualistic model of development, rural out-migration is assumed to have two main effects. First, sizable surplus generated in the industrial sector, which provides the necessary physical and working capital for development. Second, a declining labor-land ratio often provides a new environment conducive to changing rural production techniques. In addition, the transfer of labor into the more productive urban activity eventually generates a growing demand for rural output and thus alters the rural-urban terms of trade, raising agricultural prices relative to those of urban goods. The increase in agricultural prices, in turn, is likely to stimulate agricultural production and raise rural incomes. Remittances from urban areas are likely to raise rural incomes, which may not only increase the levels of consumption, but also encourage technological change that may be subsequently raise rural incomes. On the contrary, it is equally possible that rural-urban migration may lead to the lowering of rural incomes. This is largely because, as several studies have shown, most of the rural-urban migrants are generally young aged between 18 to 35 years and relatively better educated. Their movement involves transfer of human capital out of rural sector, which might adversely affect agricultural productivity and incomes and thus encourage more migration. The overall effect is extremely hard to gauge since it will depend on the period over which an assessment is being made and on whether both direct and indirect effects are considered. Above all, it depends primarily on the relative propensities of migration among the different segments of the rural population and on the flow of remittances and return migration. There is also the effect of return migration on household income distribution, to the extent that those who return to the low-income households are predominantly economic failures or return to retire, and those who return to higher income households bring along savings, knowledge, new ideas and experience. The pattern of return migration would worsen household income distribution. Now, coming to effect on rural capital formation and technological change. Outmigration from rural areas is likely to push up wage rates and encourage labor saving technological change and greater work participation by the family members left behind. Technological change would also be stimulated to the extent that out migrants repatriate savings to the rural areas in the form of remittances or capital equipments. Some studies have argued that since migration occurs partly in response to the lack of investment opportunities and to a large part due to the shortage of financial capital, remittances are potentially an important means by which growth of agricultural production and technological change could be stimulated by migration. Remittances may be used for various purposes, such as for productive investment, better housing and education, or be spent on conspicuous consumption. In addition, the full effects of remittances on capital formation in rural areas will depend on their size and frequency. Coming to consequences on urban areas. First, effect on wages and unemployment. The economic effects of migration on the urban areas are very complex. For instance, in an unregulated labor market, increase in supply labor leads to lowering of wages. In fact, the migrants may directly or indirectly raise the level of employment. Further, they may lower wage rates in urban areas as they might have been employed there, and whatever wages are available, they would accept that, or which is definitely higher compared to what they got in rural areas. Now, effect on availability of urban amenities. Excessive inflow of people in the urban areas leads to increase in the density per square kilometer, which leads to development of squatter settlements or slums. It concomitantly adds pressure on housing, and other amenities like water, drainage, sanitation, and electricity. Demand for social services such as school, hospitals, transport, and communication also increases manifold. The migrants need a shelter in the urban areas, and they are often ready to pay high rent for it, and so the influx of migrants is also likely to push up rents and land values. Also, temporary migrants are reluctant to invest much in the housing, and they prefer to rent accommodation rather than to purchase or build their own houses. Now, coming to effect on urban income distribution. The impact of migration on urban income distribution depends on the relative propensities of different group of migrants to enter the various segments of the urban labor market, as well as on their mobility potential among these segments. The urban income distribution decreases if majority of migrants enter in low income jobs. It is also affected by ability of migrants to move up financially and occupationally. Remittances are important determinants of income distribution. If the poor migrants have greater propensity to remit as well as remit a larger proportion of their income, the urban income distribution is likely to become more unequal. Effect on demographic structure of urban population is also a very important feature. Migration to urban areas leads to change in the demography of the place in different dimensions. For instance, it tends to lower the crude death rates in the urban areas. Migration also affects the population growth, since fertility in urban areas is often lower than in rural areas for a given age, education, and income. Among other factors, the lower fertility in urban areas may be due to improvement in communication, higher level of education, and higher level of modernization. So far, we have learned that what are the main determinants and consequences of migration, what are the main push and pull factors, what are the consequences of migration on rural and urban areas. It is important to note that there are many positive as well as some negative consequences on both the rural and urban areas. Questions: what are the push and pull factors of migration? How the consequences of migration in rural areas are different from that of urban areas? What is the effect of rural urban migration on urban amenities? Thank you, friends.